At 6:47 a.m. on February 19, 1945, 22-year-old Private First Class James Jimmy Caldwell watched three M4 Sherman flame tanks roll straight into a killing field on Iwo Jima's southern beach, knowing that if he couldn't figure out how to guide them to their targets in the next 8 minutes, his entire rifle squad would die trying to take those same bunkers the same way his older brother died 3 weeks earlier on the cliffs above. Former logger from Oregon timber country. 11 months of island-hopping combat across the Pacific. Zero training in tank coordination or combined arms tactics. Approximately 2,200 Japanese defenders dug into Mount Suribachi's volcanic rock, about to learn what happens when you give a Sherman flame tank to a kid who understands angles, trajectories, and how to yell directions over the sound of falling timber. The telegram had arrived at base camp 4 days earlier, forwarded from Hawaii where Jimmy's unit was staging for the Iwo Jima invasion. The chaplain found him checking his M1 Garand's firing pin in the armory tent. Private First Class Thomas Michael Caldwell killed in action, Pelelu Island, Palau. Assault on fortified cave positions, no remains recovered. Tommy was 24, older brother. The responsible one who'd enlisted first October 1942, right after their father died in a logging accident. Tommy had promised their mother he'd keep an eye on Jimmy, who'd followed him into the Marines 6 months later. Tommy's letters home had been full of optimism, talk about doing our duty and making it count. His last letter, dated January 6th, had been different, darker. He'd written about the caves on Pelelu, about how the Japanese had turned the island's limestone ridges into fortresses, about bunkers carved so deep that artillery just bounced off, about how they'd lost 47 men in one morning trying to assault a single cave complex, charging across 200 yards of open ground while machine guns fired from invisible positions. Tommy had been leading his fire team up a narrow ravine when a concealed bunker opened fire at point-blank range. He'd made it within 15 feet of the firing slit before the bullets cut him down. The same tactic everyone was trying, the same tactic that wasn't working. Born April 3, 1922, in Tillamook County, Oregon, deep in Coast Range timber country. His father, Michael Caldwell, worked as a high rigger for the Weyerhaeuser Company. His mother, Sarah, raised 4 children. Jimmy was third, between Tommy and 2 younger sisters. The family scraped by on $3.50 a day when work was steady, which it rarely was. Michael's job meant climbing 200-foot Douglas firs, topping them, rigging them with cables for the steam donkey engines to drag out. He worked 12-hour days 6 days a week when the weather held. The timber industry killed or maimed 1 out of every 12 loggers who worked a full season. Widowmakers, hung branches that fell without warning, cable snaps that sent steel lines whipping through the crew, trees that kicked back when they fell. Jimmy was 17, summer of 1939, when it happened. A new choker setter named Dutch Hansen, 21 years old from Portland, hadn't properly secured a log in the cable rigging. Dutch was working underneath, attaching the next choker, when Jimmy saw the first log shift in the rigging 40 feet above. The physics were obvious. 8,000 pounds of old-growth Douglas fir about to swing free and crush Dutch where he stood. Dutch didn't see it, couldn't hear Jimmy's warning over the steam donkey's roar. Jimmy ran, grabbed Dutch by his suspenders, threw him backward with everything he had. They both crashed into the underbrush 6 feet from where the log smashed into the ground, embedding itself 8 inches into the soft forest floor. The impact sprayed them with dirt and bark. Dutch's face went white. He couldn't stop shaking. He had a wife and a baby girl back in Portland. He thanked Jimmy for 3 straight minutes, kept saying he owed him his life. 6 weeks later, Dutch Hansen died anyway when a cable snapped and took his head off, left behind that wife and a daughter who'd just learned to walk. Because timber work was dangerous and accidents happened no matter how careful you were or how many times someone saved you. And that's just how it was. Jimmy was 19 and still working the camps when Pearl Harbor happened. Still broke, still watching men die in accidents that safety regulations could have prevented, but lumber companies wouldn't pay for. He enlisted January 15, 1942, USMC, at the recruiting station in Portland. His father, before he died in a rigging accident that March, asked him why the Marines instead of a safe job in a war plant. Jimmy's answer was, in the camps, men die so timber companies can make money. In the Marines, maybe they die for something that mattered. Tommy enlisted 8 months later, October 1942, after their father's funeral. Said he wasn't going to let his little brother fight alone. They stayed in touch through letters. Tommy's were optimistic, full of talk about duty and honor and making the family proud. Jimmy's were practical, focused on tactics and terrain and which units were taking casualties. The contrast bothered Tommy, who thought Jimmy was too cynical. Jimmy thought Tommy didn't understand that optimism didn't stop bullets.
February 17, 1945, 2 days before D-Day, 3 M4A3R3 Sherman flame tanks arrived at the 28th Marines staging area. Each tank had a crew of 5, driver, bow gunner/flamethrower operator, commander, loader, and machine gunner. Compared to standard Shermans, they were 1,200 pounds lighter, with the main gun removed, which mattered on volcanic sand that could swallow a fully loaded tank up to its tracks. The E45 flamethrower was mounted in the bow position where the .30 caliber machine gun usually sat. Range was rated at 150 yards, capacity was 290 gallons, and the napalm mixture could burn through wood, cloth, and flesh in seconds. When it hit a confined space like a bunker, it sucked all the oxygen out while simultaneously roasting everything inside. The crews had trained for 6 weeks at Camp Pendleton, mostly shooting flames at dummy targets. The gap between training and reality was absolute. You couldn't simulate smoke, chaos, enemy fire, or the simple problem that the crew couldn't see what they were supposed to burn. Jimmy's squad, 12 men from 2nd Platoon, Easy Company, 28th Marines, got assigned as infantry support for the flame tank advance. Official mission: follow 50 yards behind the tanks, suppress enemy infantry, and secure bunkers after the flames did their work. The squad leader was Corporal Frank Santos, 28 years old, from San Diego, 16 months in theater. Santos knew Japanese defensive tactics better than most. He'd survived Saipan and Tinian. February 18th, briefing, 1800 hours. Santos showed them the map. The southern beach approach to Mount Suribachi, 68 known bunker positions marked in red. Attack plan: 3-hour artillery bombardment starting at 0400, followed by tank advance at 6:30 a.m. with infantry in support. Santos simplified it. Tanks burn bunkers, we mop up survivors. Stay behind the armor, watch for bypassed positions, don't get in the tank's way. Jimmy raised his hand. Corporal, how are the tanks supposed to see the bunkers to burn them? The crews can't spot targets through all that smoke. Santos, that's their problem. Tankers have their job, we have ours. Jimmy pressed, but if they can't see what they're shooting at, they'll roll right past bunkers and we'll get caught in crossfire when... Santos cut him off. Caldwell, focus on your job. The tanks know what they're doing. We're support, not command. Understood? Jimmy didn't argue, but he was thinking about Tommy, about 47 men dying on Peleliu trying to take one cave, and about tomorrow morning when the same thing would happen again if someone didn't do something different. At 6:30 a.m. exactly, 3 Sherman flame tanks rolled forward from the beachhead. Jimmy's squad advanced behind them in a loose skirmish line, 50 yards back. Artillery had been pounding the southern approaches for 3 hours, and the entire beach was covered in smoke and volcanic dust. They advanced 200 yards before the right flank opened fire. The lead tank took 3 rapid impacts, machine gun rounds that sparked off the frontal armor but did no real damage. Sergeant Benton popped his hatch and tried to locate the bunker visually, got his head up for maybe 5 seconds. A bullet cracked past his head, missing by 8 inches. He ducked back inside, safe from bullets, but now completely blind to where the fire was coming from. Jimmy could see it clearly from his position 50 yards back. Firing slit carved into the base of a volcanic ridge, perfectly camouflaged with vegetation and shadow, about 40 yards to the tank's right front. The infantry could see exactly where the Japanese were firing from, but there was no way to communicate that to the tank crew over the sound of engines, weapons, and explosions. The tank started rotating its hull, trying to acquire the target by instinct. The enemy bunker kept firing. The noise level was overwhelming. Then a second position opened fire from the left flank, crossfire catching the lead tank in a coordinated kill zone. Jimmy was 50 yards behind the lead tank, prone in volcanic sand that was already hot enough to burn exposed skin. He could see both bunkers clearly, The right flank position at 40 yards, the left flank position at 55 yards, both with perfect fields of fire. He could see exactly where the tank's flamethrower needed to aim. The tank crew was doing everything wrong, rotating the hull blindly, searching for targets they'd never find from inside that armored box. He looked at Corporal Santos. Santos was yelling at his radio operator, trying to coordinate with other squads, completely focused on the bigger tactical picture. Nobody was solving the immediate problem. The tanks couldn't see what needed burning. The second bunker opened fire in earnest, heavy machine gun tearing up the ground around the tank. The lead Sherman was caught between two positions, taking fire from both flanks. Sergeant Benton's hatch cracked open again. He stuck his head up, trying desperately to spot the enemy positions visually. A bullet hit the hatch rim 6 inches from his face. He dropped back inside, safe from bullets, blind to targets. The design paradox that would get them all killed. Jimmy made a decision. He stood up. "Caldwell, get down!" Santos screamed behind him. He ignored it. He ran toward the tank, legs pumping through loose volcanic sand. Enemy fire tracked his movement. Bullets snapped past his head, kicked up sand at his feet. He didn't slow down. Reached the tank's side, pounded on the hull with his rifle butt. Nothing. The crew couldn't hear him over the engine roar and gunfire. He started climbing, boots slipping on the sloped armor, grabbing handholds wherever he could find them. He made it to the engine deck. Machine gun fire from the right flank bunker hit the armor plating below him. Sparks flying, ricochets whining off into the volcanic rock. He crawled forward to the commander's hatch, pounded on it with both fists. The hatch popped open. Sergeant Benton's face appeared, confused and angry and scared. Jimmy pointed at the right flank bunker, his arm extended like a compass needle, pointing directly at the firing slit. He screamed over the noise. "There! Right there! 40 yards! 10 o'clock!"
Benton understood immediately. He dropped back inside, shouted orders to his gunner. The tank's hull started rotating. Jimmy stayed on the engine deck, continuing to point, adjusting his aim as the tank moved. "More left, 5 degrees. There, stop. Fire!" Benton's command carried through the open hatch. The flamethrower erupted. A stream of burning napalm arced through the air, hit the bunker's firing slit, splashed inside. The entire position erupted in orange flame, screaming, smoke, then nothing. The right flank bunker was dead. Jimmy immediately swung around, pointed at the left flank bunker. 55 yards, 2 o'clock. The gunner rotated. Jimmy guided with precise hand signals. Right, right, stop, up slightly. There. Second fire command. Second stream of flame. Second bunker destroyed. Time elapsed, 30 seconds. 2 bunkers down. Jimmy jumped off the tank, hit the sand running, made it back to the squad. Santos grabbed him by the harness. "What the hell do you think you're making the tanks work? Because Tommy died charging bunkers just like those, and I'm not watching more men die when there's a better way." The attack continued. 4 more tanks rolled forward, pushing deeper into the defensive network. Infantry advanced in their wake, clearing back past positions. But now the tanks had a spotter. Jimmy's new role: run alongside the lead tank until a bunker opened fire, climb on, point to the target, guide the gunner, burn it out, then dismount and move to the next one. The process repeated. Bunker fires, Jimmy climbs, guides, gunner fires, bunker dies. It was reckless, suicidal, completely exposed. Machine gun fire followed him every time he broke cover. Bullets passed within 6 inches of his head 11 times by his later count. He should have been killed before he made it to the second bunker, then the third, then the fourth, but the method worked. By 08:15 hours, 95 minutes into the assault, they destroyed 23 bunkers using the same method. All 23 eliminated by flame tanks, with Jimmy Caldwell climbing onto the hull and physically pointing at targets while Japanese machine guns tried to kill him. The Japanese recognized the pattern and adapted. By 08:30 hours, every bunker that opened fire immediately shifted targeting to Jimmy the moment he appeared. Concentrated fire, multiple positions coordinating. They knew, kill the spotter, the tanks go blind again. At 08:47 hours, a Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun scored a direct hit on the right track of the second Sherman. The track shattered, the tank slewed sideways, and something ruptured in the fuel system. Napalm started leaking from a punctured line, pooling underneath the disabled tank. The crew tried to bail out. 2 made it clear, the driver and bow gunner. 2 were trapped inside, Sergeant Benton and the loader. Fire was spreading from the leaking fuel, climbing up the hull. If it reached the main fuel tank, the whole thing would detonate with both men still inside. Jimmy was 40 yards away when the anti-tank round hit. He saw 3 things simultaneously: the fuel leak,
the fire spreading, and Benton's face through the commander's hatch, trying to force it open while smoke filled the interior. He ran. Corporal Santos screamed behind him, "Caldwell, stay down! You'll die!" The hull was already hot enough to blister skin. Flames were climbing up the right side, driven by wind and leaking fuel. Jimmy grabbed the commander's hatch with both hands, felt the metal sear his palms, ripped it open through pure adrenaline and desperation. Flames burst out from the superheated interior. He grabbed Benton by his harness, pulled him clear, dragged him 15 feet from the tank before going back. The loader, Private Garcia, was still inside, trapped by his position in the cramped interior. Jimmy reached in through flames and smoke, found Garcia's arm, pulled. Garcia came free. Jimmy dragged him away from the tank, both men coughing from smoke inhalation. Benton was burned on his hands and face, but alive. Garcia had second-degree burns on his legs, but alive. 14 seconds after Jimmy pulled Garcia clear, the fuel tank detonated. The explosion sent a fireball 40 feet high and turned the sand within a 15-foot radius into glass. Jimmy had been standing exactly where that fireball erupted, but the crew was clear. Both men survived their injuries. Benton would return to duty 6 weeks later. Garcia would spend 4 months in recovery, but lived. Jimmy's hands were burned badly enough that blisters formed immediately, second-degree burns across both palms. His left arm had a shrapnel cut from the explosion, bleeding through his uniform. The corpsman tried to treat him, wanted to tag him for evacuation to the beach aid station. Jimmy refused. His reasoning was simple. More bunkers to kill, more tanks that couldn't see their targets, more men who'd die if someone didn't guide the flames. He climbed onto the lead tank again, pointed at the next bunker. The flamethrower fired. The bunker burned. By 9:30 hours, they'd eliminated 31 fortified positions. The Japanese defensive line was fracturing. Infantry was advancing past the burning bunkers, pushing upslope toward Mount Suribachi's base. The breakthrough was happening, but the Japanese weren't finished. The final defensive position was the command bunker for the entire Suribachi South sector. Construction was superior to everything they'd hit so far. 8-foot thick walls of reinforced concrete and steel rails, buried under 12 feet of volcanic rock. It served as the coordination point for the entire defensive network, with firing ports covering 3 different approach vectors and pre-registered mortar positions that could drop rounds anywhere on the southern slope with called coordinates. The Japanese inside were prepared to die. They'd watched 31 of their positions burn in 3 hours. They knew what was coming. The lead tank approached at 09:45 hours. The bunker opened fire with everything. 2 machine guns, rifle fire from multiple ports, and a light mortar that started dropping rounds in a pattern designed to separate infantry from armor. The tank's armor held against small arms, but the crew couldn't locate the bunker, too well hidden behind smoke, vegetation, and the chaotic terrain of volcanic ridges. Jimmy climbed onto the tank again. He was looking for the bunker, scanning the ridgeline, when he saw the firing slits. 3 positions arranged in a triangle, the main command post in the center. He started to point it out.
A mortar round impacted 12 feet to his left. The explosion picked him up and threw him off the tank. He hit the ground hard, head slamming into volcanic rock. Everything went white. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, ringing in his ears so loud he couldn't hear the battle anymore. He stood up anyway. Blood was running down his face from a scalp wound. His ears were ringing. His vision was blurred. Corporal Santos was screaming something at him. "Stay down! Take cover! Stop being suicidal!" But Jimmy couldn't hear the words, only saw Santos's mouth moving. Jimmy climbed back onto the tank, found his position on the engine deck, pointed at the main command bunker, his arm rock steady despite the blood and concussion and burned hands. Sergeant Benton followed his direction from inside the hull. The hull rotated. The flamethrower elevated, tracking toward the target. Jimmy watched the weapon line up, watched the angle adjust, watched Benton give the command he couldn't hear but could see through the open hatch. The flamethrower fired. Napalm arced through the air, hit the command bunker's central firing port, splashed through every opening in the interconnected position. The entire structure erupted in flames, fire bursting from all 3 firing ports simultaneously, smoke boiling into the sky. The command bunker was destroyed. The Suribachi fortified zone's southern sector was broken. Final time, 09:53 hours. Total bunkers eliminated, 38. The defensive line that was supposed to hold for 3 days had collapsed in 3 hours and 23 minutes. Infantry was advancing up the mountain slopes. The advance was resuming. Total American casualties in the southern sector assault were 23 wounded, 4 killed.
Intelligence had projected 200-plus casualties for this phase of the operation. The innovation's effectiveness was proven. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had taken heavily fortified bunker complexes without massive infantry casualties. But the tanks only worked because Private First Class James Caldwell had guided them to their targets. When the southern sector secured at 10:47 hours, Lieutenant Colonel Randall arrived from the Beachhead command post. He'd been monitoring the assault by radio and couldn't believe the casualty figures. He'd expected to commit 2 more companies and accept 30% losses. Instead, 1 platoon and 3 tanks had broken the entire position in under 4 hours. Randall found Jimmy sitting against the track of the lead tank. Corman wrapping his burned hands, blood still running from the head wound, face covered in volcanic dust and smoke residue, left arm bandaged from shrapnel, barely conscious from concussion. "Who authorized you to climb onto those tanks, Private?" "Nobody, sir. Just did what needed doing." "Randall, you violated tactical doctrine, broke chain of command, exposed yourself to enemy fire in direct contradiction of cover and concealment protocols. You understand you could face a court-martial." "Yes, sir. But the tanks couldn't see the bunkers. Someone had to show them. I wasn't going to watch more men charging those positions when there was a better solution." Randall looked at him for a long moment. Then he said what everyone on that volcanic beach already knew. Jimmy had saved more lives that morning than any piece of equipment in the Marine Corps' inventory. The flame tanks were brilliant engineering, revolutionary weapons, the culmination of 2 years of development work. But they were useless without someone like you making them work. Randall wrote the commendation that afternoon, February 19, 1945. Recommended Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The paperwork went up through Division, Corps, and Fleet Command. Approved at every level. Award ceremony was held March 12, 1945, on board USS El Dorado off Iwo Jima. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner presented the medal. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty while serving with the 28th Marines during action against enemy Japanese forces on Iwo Jima. Private First Class Caldwell, with complete disregard for his own safety, repeatedly exposed himself to intense enemy fire to guide armored flame tanks to fortified positions, enabling the destruction of 38 enemy bunkers and pillboxes. Despite severe wounds, he rescued 2 trapped tank crew members from a burning vehicle, saving their lives. His actions enabled the capture of critical terrain with minimal friendly casualties and demonstrated exceptional courage under fire." What the citation didn't mention was Tommy. What the citation didn't mention was the telegram. What the citation didn't mention was, there had to be a better way. But Jimmy knew. Every time he looked at that medal for the rest of his life, he thought about his brother dying in a ravine on Peleliu, and how 38 bunkers on Iwo Jima didn't kill 38 more Tommies because someone finally figured out how to make the tanks work. The innovation became standard doctrine within 6 weeks. After Iwo Jima, Marine Corps Command realized what should have been obvious. Flame tanks needed infantry spotters, needed someone outside the vehicle to guide the crew to targets. The 1st Tank Battalion developed formal protocols by March 1945. They trained designated spotters, created hand signal communication systems, established procedures for tank infantry coordination under fire. By April 1945, every Marine tank operation in the Pacific included trained spotters. The tactics spread to other units, the 6th Marine Division on Okinawa, the 1st Marine Division preparing for the Japan invasion, Army tank units operating in the Philippines. Everywhere American forces faced fortified Japanese defensive positions, flame tanks with infantry spotters broke through bunker lines. Casualties dropped dramatically. At Peleliu, Tommy's battle, infantry assaults on cave complexes resulted in 47% casualty rates. At Iwo Jima's southern sector, using flame tanks with infantry spotters, the rate dropped to 6%. Statistical comparison across the Okinawa campaign showed similar results. Previous operations without coordinated spotters averaged 34% casualties in bunker assaults. Operations with trained spotters averaged 11%. The difference was James Caldwell climbing onto a tank and pointing. Jimmy survived the war. He fought through the rest of Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, where he continued working as a designated tank spotter through June 1945. He was training for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs fell. When the war ended August 15, 1945, he was on board a transport ship in the Pacific, heading toward what would have been the largest amphibious invasion in history.
He returned home November 3, 1945, to Tillamook, Oregon. Went back to the logging camps, back to the same brutal work his father had died doing, the same industry that had destroyed his hearing and his back by the time he was 20. He never talked much about the war. When people in town asked about the Navy Cross, he'd deflect. Just did my job. Plenty of other guys did more. When pressed, he'd minimize. I happened to be in the right place. Somebody had to show the tankers where to shoot. He worked the timber camps until 1967, when his body finally broke down. Chronic back pain from decades of heavy labor, hearing almost completely gone in both ears, lung damage from years of smoke inhalation, both from combat and from burning timber slash. He retired at 45, medically disabled. Lived quietly in a small house outside Tillamook after that. He married Sarah Jensen in 1948. They had 3 daughters, born in 1949, 1952, and 1955. He didn't name any of them after Tommy, said it hurt too much to think about. But he talked to his daughters about their uncle, about Tommy's dreams of becoming a teacher after the war, about what should have been different, about how the war took good men who deserved better than dying in front of bunkers that artillery couldn't crack. In 1968, the Marine Corps published The United States Marine Corps in World War II, a comprehensive history. The book covered flame tank development, engineering innovations, tactical evolution, and major battles across the Pacific Theater. The Iwo Jima operation got 47 pages. The Southern Sector Assault was described as the first successful operational use of coordinated tank infantry tactics against fortified positions. There was a note about coordination being critical to the weapon's effectiveness. James Caldwell's name appeared twice, once in a casualty list noting his Navy Cross award, once in a footnote about tank infantry coordination protocols being developed after the battle. That was the extent of his recognition in official histories. Dense military prose that nobody outside of Marine Corps staff colleges and military historians would ever read. But the men who fought at Iwo Jima remembered differently. They remembered a skinny kid from Oregon climbing onto flame tanks while machine guns tried to kill him. They remembered him pointing at bunkers with burned hands wrapped in bandages. They remembered him pulling Benton and Garcia from a burning tank while napalm cooked off around him. Corporal Frank Santos wrote about it in letters to his family. He said the tanks would have been useless without Jimmy, that they would have rolled past every bunker, gotten flanked, gotten destroyed, and the infantry would have gone back to the old tactic, charging across open ground the same way Tommy Caldwell died on Peleliu. Santos said Jimmy saved at least 100 lives that morning, probably more. Sergeant Roy Benton wrote about it too. His memoir, Through Fire and Armor, was published by a small military history press in 1972. Print run, 2,000 copies, mostly purchased by veterans organizations and military libraries. Benton described the flame tanks as the revolutionary weapons, the most effective bunker-busting system developed during the war. But he was clear that they only worked because Jimmy Caldwell made them work. Without spotters, Benton wrote, the tanks were expensive mobile bonfires that couldn't hit anything they couldn't see, which was everything. Mainstream histories focused elsewhere, on Iwo Jima's flag raising, on the strategic importance of the island, on the broader Pacific campaign. The flame tank innovation became a footnote, a technical detail in the appendices. It wasn't dramatic enough for popular history, didn't fit the narrative of heroic infantry charges or strategic bombing campaigns. James Caldwell died February 19, 1989, exactly 45 years to the day after his actions on Iwo Jima. He was 66 years old. The death certificate listed cause as congestive heart failure, but the real causes were more complicated. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from smoke exposure, spinal degeneration from decades of logging work, and accumulated damage from combat wounds that never fully healed. The obituary ran in the Tillamook Headlight Herald, February 22, 1989. Basic content: James Caldwell, 66, Navy Cross recipient and World War II Marine Corps veteran, died Monday at home. Survived by wife Sarah, daughters Linda, Patricia, and Joan, and 7 grandchildren. That was it. Nothing about Iwo Jima, nothing about the tactical revolution, nothing about the lives saved. The funeral was held at Tillamook United Methodist Church. Family attended, friends from town, a handful of elderly veterans who'd served in different units, different wars, but they all understood the brotherhood. No military ceremony, no honor guard. Jimmy had specifically requested no military funeral, said he didn't want the fuss, didn't deserve it more than any other Marine who'd done their job.
3 unknown men showed up at the reception afterwards. They introduced themselves to Jimmy's daughters at the church hall. They were former Marines. One had fought on Okinawa, one in the Philippines, one during the Korea campaign. Different wars, different islands, but they all had used the tank spotter tactic. All of them credited it with their survival. All of them knew the tactic started with Jimmy Caldwell on Iwo Jima's southern beach. They told the daughters something Jimmy had never said himself, that their father had changed the war in ways most people would never understand, that he'd saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives by figuring out how to make a weapon work when everyone else had given up on it.
Today, there's a small exhibit at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. It covers Pacific Theater armored operations. There's a section on flame tank development and deployment. The centerpiece is a restored M4A3 R3 Zippo flame tank, painted in the markings of the 713th Tank Battalion. Next to it is a black and white photograph of a Sherman flame tank in action, napalm streaming from the bow position. The placard reads, "Flame tanks were first successfully employed in coordinated operations at Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. The integration of infantry spotters with armored flame units proved decisive in reducing fortified Japanese positions with minimal casualties. This tactical innovation was rapidly adopted across the Pacific Theater and remained standard doctrine through the end of the war." What the placard doesn't mention, James Caldwell's name. What the placard doesn't mention, that the vehicles were useless until he climbed on. What the placard doesn't mention, the guidance under fire with machine guns tracking his movement. What the placard doesn't mention, pulling 2 men from a burning tank while napalm exploded around him. The innovation is remembered. The equipment is remembered. The tactic is remembered. The logger from Tillamook County who made it all work is forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is what we do on this channel. We rescue stories like Jimmy Caldwell's from the archives where they've been buried for decades. We find the working class heroes, the enlisted men, the people who made history but didn't get to write it. Every single week, we bring you another story that textbooks ignored. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. You're the reason James Caldwell's daughters might someday see this video and know that their father's story mattered to someone besides the men who fought beside him. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did your family serve in World War II? In the Pacific? Do you have stories like this that never made it into the history books? Just let us know you're here. Because every comment, every story shared, every memory preserved, that's how we make sure men like Jimmy Caldwell don't disappear completely. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next time you see a war memorial or read about a famous battle, think about all the James Caldwells who aren't named on the plaques. The loggers and farmers and factory workers who solved the problems that generals couldn't. They're the ones who actually won the war. We'll see you next week with another story they don't teach in school.